So today I have the pleasure to welcome back to the Vienna Migration Conference one of Europe's finest and most respected geopolitical thinkers, Ivan Krastev. Welcome.
Thank you.
Ivan, as well as being for many years the chairman of the Sofia-based Center for Liberal Strategies, you're also the author of many highly regarded books on Europe, on the history of liberal democracy, both before and after the Cold War. You're a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences here in Vienna and a contributing editor with the Financial Times. Your thoughts are eagerly sought out by chancelleries and prime ministers' offices, not just here in Europe, but also further afield. And before Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine, you were even a regular visitor to the Lake Valdai conference on the invitation of Vladimir Putin. We're really privileged to have you here with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
We often think of liberals as optimists, but as a colleague of mine would put it, your work might be better described as quite inspired by Schopenhauer. Your insights are original, always, extremely well expressed, rooted in a superb historical understanding, but the conclusions consistently lean pessimistic. In 2017, you wrote that the train has left the station in terms of an accelerating populism that could destroy the European project. Now, with very critical elections coming up in France and in Germany over the next 2-3 years, do you feel vindicated in that prediction? Are we in the midst of a revolution?
Thank you very much. First, I want to tell you from the very beginning, I'm not a migration expert. On the positive side, I'm Bulgarian, and we have most probably fortune tellers per capita than most of the countries in the world. This is why we dare to make this big generalization. But listen, we're in a difficult moment, and you can decide to be optimist or pessimist. It does not basically change the fact that the European Union goes through a major transformation. This is not just one crisis. There was a different type of crisis. On economic side, you have the war in Ukraine. You basically had COVID, which in my view is totally underestimated on the impact also of changing European politics and some of the voting behaviors. So as a result of it, obviously, we are going to talk not simply about, for example, enlarging European Union, we are talking about a major transformation of the Union. And also the world around us is changing dramatically. Keep in mind that many of the things on which the European Union was based has been dramatically challenged by what we are seeing. Just look at the war in Ukraine. European Union was based on the idea that economic interdependence is the major source of security. In the case of Russia, it became a major source of insecurity. European Union was convinced that military power has lost its purchase power. Suddenly we realized that military power doesn't matter when you don't have it. Basically, the world around us and how Europe is perceived in the world. For a long period of time, basically, we believe that the world is admiring us. And then you can see much more resentment in different places. And this is a new reality. And then, of course, come the migration issues. And I'm going to say that in a strange way, you have a different type of migrants in Europe. You have a lot of people outside of Europe who cross the physical borders of the European Union, but most of the far-right voters, they're also migrants. Simply, they want to migrate back in time. They want to basically go to a different type of countries that they knew this and so on. So this level of movement of people, of ideas, of votes, is really dramatic. So from this point of view, I'm a cheerful pessimist. From this point of view, I always believe that being too pessimistic can end up that you can commit a suicide out of the fear of death, and this is not going to help anybody. But on the other side, just to tell ourselves that everything is fine, that everything is under control, is not true. And it's basically not true because most of the voters don't feel like this. And for me, this is kind of the answer to the question. There was this old Jewish joke about a husband who went somewhere in the countryside and wrote a telegram to his wife saying, "Start worrying, details to follow." I do believe we're in this stage.
You spent much of last year in Oxford preparing to publish a book that argues that EU may well fragment in the teeth of this popular backlash, and specifically over Europe's climate change reforms and concerns over migration. You seem to have seen this coming long before this year's election. Perhaps you can share the basic thesis with our audience on politics of these polarizing issues and others also that impact this, such as the emergence of the class of super rich and new technologies, artificial intelligence.
There are different trends. One of my major argument is the following. We focus on migration, and of course we face something that Hans Magnus Enzensberger in the beginning of the 1990s defined as demographic bulimia. This is a kind of a bottleneck feeling that there are too many people and too few people at the same time. Too many of them and too few of us. And this is a real critical issue because even if you see on the priorities that you have been voting for, there is a major labor shortages in Europe. And everybody understands that basically, in the absence of migration, the social and economic models that we have simply cannot be sustained. And then politically, you try to understand that basically migration is one of the issues that is creating a situation in which basically the government has a death rate which is much higher than ever before. And I do believe this dilemma is critically important, and my idea is go slightly deeper than this. It's not simply about migration. We see something that I'm going to call the politics of demographic anxiety. Listen, in most of the countries, not only Europe, the majority countries in the world, we have a fertility rate which is below replacement level. For the first time, we have a fears that are very different than a century ago. Century ago, everything was about overpopulation. Now the major story is about depopulation. The major story is about a changing age of our societies. We are graying. You're going to have much kind of older societies. You, by the way, is going to have much higher number of people older than 80, which is going to change our health system dramatically. And also what is dramatically changing is the relations between different generations. You have a higher number of people and families without kids. You have a totally different understanding of how you think about the future. On the other side, if you go to the Silicon Valley, you're going to see people who really start to believe in the individual immortality, at least if you see where they're putting their money into. So as a result of it, this is a dramatic change in which you're understanding what is human, what is home, how you look at all this. And my idea is we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but future has stopped to be a project. We start to talk about future in terms of projections, and demographers are great at projecting. So basically we know exactly, for example, how the future of the population is going to look like. By the way, many of these projections can turn to be wrong, but when you're in office, you're thinking about this. One of my major arguments was that nobody is ever going to understand why Putin invaded Ukraine if he does not know that he has a total obsession with Russia's demographic decline. It was not a war about land, it was a war about population. It was about, in a certain way, Ukrainians had to be Russians because there was not enough Russians in the world. So 6 months before the war, on several occasions, the Russian president went and said, if it was not for the World War II, if it was not for the Bolshevik Revolution, there had to be 500 million Russians in the world today. I'm saying this because this fear that you're losing population is critically important. And one of my major arguments during the 2015-2016 debate was that it's not simply the fear of the people coming. This is also the trauma of the people that have left that basically defined this demographic anxiety. I'm Bulgarian. By the way, Bulgaria is the fastest shrinking demographically country in history in the absence of war or natural disaster. In 1989, there were 9 million people almost in the country. Now there are less than 6.5. Can you imagine how this is changing the way people perceive what is happening around them? Can you imagine the nature of fears? And secondly, when you go and put on this history, the obsession with an ethnic homogeneity in most of the post-imperial states that have been created. This is a different world. And this is changing dramatically politics, and this is my last point, and you're going to see it very strongly if you follow the American debate. Migration is also a big problem for democracies because not simply people are coming. Many of them, you look at them as a future voters. And then comes this paranoia that governments are going to elect their own people, that you're going to give citizenship because you expect how these people are going to vote. By the way, empirically, this has never been proved. I have been going through most of the data. Many of the people who get the citizenship rarely continue to vote for the party that gave them citizenship. They're changing their vote. But this fear is there. And I'm saying this because all this kind of a politics of demographic imagination is much bigger than migration, but at the end of the day, migration is at the center of this. And talking about the studies that we have been doing with the European Council on Foreign Relations, this is something that probably is going to interest you, particularly those who go for elections. The major difference between far right and others when they come to power is not what is happening on the ground, but how people perceive it. Since Mrs. Meloni came to power, the number of illegal migrants in Italy does not decrease, it has increased. But at the same time, basically Italians do not claim that migration is the major issue. Secondly, there is a major gap between how people talk about migration on one side and on the other side the need to have new people on the labor market. So we're in a schizophrenic situation. And by the way, some of the governments that have the harshest anti-migration rhetoric are also the governments that has the highest work permit being given to foreign workers. And how to get and how to change the debate, and this is why I do believe that the Vienna conference is important, we are talking in a self-defeating way. The first 15 minutes, we're talking how you're going to stop people. The next 15 minutes, how you're going to bring people. And then people stop believing you. They have the feeling that you don't know what you're talking about. And one of the major stories that also we have learned from the crisis of 2015, 2016, this is the feeling that people start to suspect that the situation is not under control. And as a result of it, basically, it's not simply about migration, it's many other things, but the migration crisis became the major manifestation of the fact and of the fear of the part of the population that situation is not under control, that governments are really not in charge of things. And this is why it has such a strong political impact when it comes how people are voting.
So continuing on that, when we spoke 4 years ago, you said that Europe, on a strict reading of the law, acts as if it wants asylum seekers and doesn't want labor migrants, when in reality it is the exact opposite. You were now talking about how the rhetoric is going. So after spending the last 2 years thinking more now about migration, and have you had any reflections then on how governments are actually going to deal with this issue of huge shortage of foreign workers? And what you think is the most likely political outcome over the coming years?
Listen, Europe started to be fragmented on many different ways, and this is not so unexpected. But keep in mind that we're talking about migration, but in different places. We talk about people coming from different countries, coming for different reasons. The major story is that most of the societies are going to agree and said, we need people, but also what we want is to decide who to come and who not, and if we're unhappy, people to go back. Listen, this is good for a novel, but this is not how it happens in real life, because people are moving. Also, don't forget that there are going to be certain developments that are going to dramatically change the current debate. If Donald Trump is going to be elected, and if he decides to try to deport on a massive level, I don't know how realistic or unrealistic it is, but I do believe he was genuine when he said that in the first 2 or 3 months he would do it. You're going to, the moment you have a kind of a massive deportation, in many countries there are going to be people who said, if it can happen in the United States, why it's not happening here? And there are going to be governments, there are going to be parties which are going to be really under pressure. By the way, the moment it starts, then basically the American president is going to learn something. It is one thing to abstractly agree of deporting people. It's totally different to when you start deporting people that you know, that have been part of your community. And then, as a friend of mine was joking, he said in Arizona, we cannot bus the refugees or the migrants basically to the border because all the bus drivers are migrants. And I'm saying all this because these are going to be events and things are going to happen. What you're seeing, for example, on the Polish-Belarusian borders, before it you see on the Turkish-Greek border, to be absolutely honest. There is also a fear of weaponization of migration, and that in a world with a kind of a strong geopolitical tensions, this can be used because, listen, if you believe that something really can affect elections, imagine Poland. Country is going to face a really critical presidential elections in 6 months. There is a war on the border, and the war does not go well. So from this point of view, you try to see everything that you're seeing in these terms. And this is why, in my view, the expert knowledge is one thing, and how basically you're trying to do with the practical issues is another. But we need a totally different narrative. And this is particularly true because in different countries, concerns are different. In some countries, the concerns are basically because some of these countries are countries that does not have much of experience to live in a much more diverse societies. To be honest, Eastern Europe, for the last 50, 60 years, this was true. And by the way, you cannot blame East Europeans. If you look at the map of Europe in the year 1900, you're going to see two Europes. One was ethnically and culturally quite unified, and this was Western Europe, Germany, France. And the other, which was very diverse, and this was the Habsburg lands, part of the Russian Empire, part of the Ottoman Empire. And then you have 20th century, and we used to say that 20th century people have been moving, but people have been moving in the 20th century making countries more and more ethnically homogeneous. In 1939, around 1/3 of the population of Poland were not ethnic Poles. And then came the war, destructions of the Jews, expulsions of the Germans, basically Ukrainians, and so on. And you end with a situation in which almost more than 95% of the situation was ethnic Poles. It was not Poles who decided this. But as a result of it, basically you have 50 or 60 years in which different governments are telling the people that ethnic homogeneity is the very basic of the sovereignty of the state. And now you have a major change. Imagine that basically in the last 3 years before of the war of Ukraine, the number of basically Ukrainians living in Poland went up dramatically. So you should solve all this problem that comes from history, from geography, in a very short period of time. And in my view, the time pressure is the biggest problem on Europe. Because what Europe needs is time, and what Europe does not have is time.
Thank you. I think that is a fascinating point. You mentioned the elections in the US already. In a little bit over a week, we will see the results of one of the most important elections of our times. How are you viewing it?
Listen, United States is a deeply divided society, and this is not going to disappear after the elections, regardless of how the elections are going to end up. But of course, the elections are going to impact Europe in several critical aspects. One is, by the way, regardless of who is going to win the elections, Europe is not as central to the American politics as it used to be. We have been repeating this over the years, but we never believed it. It's time to start believing it. Also, American society has changed dramatically. People coming from European backgrounds has dramatically decreased. And as a result of it, basically, if you look at the American politics, what they're interested in, what they're referring, you're going to see that America is much more looking in geopolitical politics toward China and Asia. And from ethnic and cultural point of view, of course, Latin America is becoming much more important because they are where the people come from. So for Europe, the biggest problem is going to be in this world in which you have much more polarization, but also fragmentation at the same time, where to come and basically get our place. And also what I do believe, and I could be very much wrong, but I do believe also in the next decade we are going to see a major rise of the activity of the middle powers. very different country, India, Brazil, Turkey, but also Saudi Arabia, but also Israel. In this moment of resettling and reshaping of the world, they try to find a place in recognition, and they're going to be highly active. This is not a non-alignment movement. They go in different directions. They compete with themselves, but with kind of a risk to say something which is not politically correct. But many of them are going to have the mentality of a teenager, which means that they have so much energy and they are so much looking for recognition that basically they are trying to be active in all directions at the same time, trying to mediate every possible conflicts, try to be here and there, because this is a kind of a world in which they see disorder and they try basically to see it as an opportunity and not simply as a risk. Europe is in a difficult position because European Union was the major beneficiary of the previous international order. And when something starts changing, in the most difficult positions are the winners of the previous game. First, because for a long time we tried to defend the status quo that is not existing anymore. The world has changed dramatically, and we try to believe that we still can keep it where it was, that basically it's going to return. It's not going to return where it was. And secondly, in my view, the problem for Europe is that in this situation where the United States is changing this position, imagine, for example, what is going to happen if you have certain trade wars and others. We try to decide first what we want, but secondly what we can do. Because you can see this also with the war in Ukraine. The security fears of the different countries are not the same. For countries like Poland, the Baltic republics, the Scandinavians, what is happening in Ukraine is not about Ukraine. It's about their core security. For others, it's much more solidarity than security concern. Others are fearing other things. And how to create a common threat perceptions is not simple because we are a big continent. There is something really depressing in the fact that at the moment, the Russians are producing more ammunition than the European Union and the United States taken together. If you see the size of our economies, it should not be like this. It should not be like this, but in a certain way it's so difficult, and so difficult because European Union, in my view, at this moment, is much more the victim of its successes than of its failures. The biggest success of the European Union was that we made war unthinkable. And the biggest threat is that we have made war unthinkable.
On that note, let's open to the floor and see if there are any questions or comments in the audience. I see two. One here first.
Sorry.
Okay.
Is it me?
Just.
Thank you very much. I'm representing the Turkish Republic and the Minister of Foreign Affairs here, so appreciate the ADHD teenager politics diagnosis. Since we find Baba Yaga here, I'd like to ask about the Middle East, and how do you see this current conflict and the aggression in Middle East and the response of the EU? Is it a betrayal of its own founding principles, the standards, and how is that going to affect the future of the EU per se? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take a second question further in the back.
Thanks, and thank you for a fascinating discussion. Ivan, I think you once wrote, Europe is terrified of its own attractiveness in terms of the political reaction to asylum seekers. And in human history, apart from maybe Justin Trudeau, no politician has gotten up on a platform at election time and said, if you elect me, I will dramatically increase inward immigration to the country. Given that for the first time we're talking about a new geopolitics in demographics, could that change? Could that actually change in politics? Or will we have to find a way to open the gates and let people quietly in while convincing the public that we're in control? You know, which is the right way to go? Try and change the actual basis of the conversation, or show the public you're in control and rely on their silent consent for immigration?
Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions at this point, so let's turn back to Ivan.
Yeah, I think both of the questions are really both difficult and kind of important. Listen, Middle East is a huge problem on 3 different levels for Europe. One is on the major security issue. Listen, Europe is next to the Middle East, and if you go for regional war, and of what we are seeing much more, we can expect that Israeli-Iran war is much more likely than unlikely. This is going to affect everything. Then basically Europe is going to be surrounded by 2 wars. By the way, 2 wars that involve nuclear powers. Secondly, from the identity point of view, and this I can imagine is a major disappointment for everybody out of European Union, the story was that European identity, and particularly the identity of the European Union, was very much based on the Holocaust. And you can see this very much, particularly in countries like Germany. So as a result of it, basically, any discourse about Israel is also a discourse on European identity. And secondly, you're going to have not simply basically people coming from the Middle East as the result of these wars, because people are going to move. You don't want to live in Lebanon today. Most of these people are going to come with a totally different idea of history. And by the way, the division when it comes to relations towards Israel is going to be very much big. You can already see this in the case of France, a country which has 2 very big communities, both Jewish community and basically the Arab Muslim communities. And for them, the problem of migration more and more starts to become a security issue than simply basically labor issue or cultural issue. You know that yesterday or the day before yesterday, the French government decided to reintroduce the borders. They were using very much a classical security argument because they're afraid that because of the war in the Middle East, the proximity and kind of the risk of a terrorist attack is going much up. How this is going to affect Europe, you're saying? It's going to affect our domestic politics. We were about double standards when you talk Middle East or Ukraine. We were. So, are we the only one that want double standards? We are not. And this is part of the story. The problem is that for European Union, strangely enough, European Union is much more attacked for its hypocrisy than anybody else. On one level, because we had a much stronger moralized language, but also because we are not perceived as powerful enough. People basically are much more ready to close their eyes, for example, to the hypocrisy of the Americans because they're too powerful, so you don't want to deal with them. So all the moral outrage is reserved for the Europeans. But on the Palestinian issues, I do believe that there is a lot of questions to be asked to some of the Gulf countries and others. Because if you see the money going to the Palestinians before the war, do you believe it's much more normal that most of the money were coming from Europe and most of the money are money that are coming from the countries which otherwise declared huge solidarity with the Palestinian cause? Were not particularly impressive. But it is going to be difficult, and this is going to be really difficult to negotiate because publics are part of politics today. Public opinion matters. In the case of the Middle East, it's divided. By the way, there's a major division between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And this is something that is going to be reality for all of the conflicts that we are seeing. There are major, by the way, divisions even when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I have been reading a lot of opinion polls. And here's the story. If you see the public opinion on support for Ukraine, you're going to see the borders of the old empires, not the Soviet one. First, the Russian Empire. The countries that have been part of the Russian Empire are the most supportive for Ukraine. Finland, Baltics, Poland. Then you come part of the Ottoman Empire. Not much, because kind of their anti-imperialism was not anti-Russian. Habsburgs, like always, are in the middle. But I'm saying all this because this kind of a long history is coming back. And we are going to reconcile it, and it's not going to be easy. And of course, it's not going to be easy for the European Union because different member states has different fears, different history, different priorities. So, and then you come how demography is going to affect all this. Listen, there is only one place in the world in which we have a high demographic growth, and this is sub-Saharan Africa. From this point of view, depopulation and demographic decline is not a Western disease. China, because of their one-child policy, has a dramatic decline of population. India, by the way, also goes very much in a direction of a decline of the population. There is only in sub-Saharan Africa that you're really going to have a much more increase of the population, and they're kind of late in their demographic transition. As a result of it, you're going to end up in a world in which in the year 2100, basically the projections is, because as you know, projections go from here to there, but the population of the Russian Federation, imagine the size of Russia, is going to be between 74 and 100 million. And Nigeria is going to be between 700 and 800 million. This is a different world. And by the way, probably this world is not going to come. We don't know. Many things can change. But the moment when you look at the demographic projections, what it means in terms of economy, by the way, what it means in terms of a military power, what it means in terms of a climate change, keep in mind that 40% of the land in Russia is a frozen land. If you're going to have a climate change, you're going to have major freezing. Some new agricultural land is going to appear. On the other side, certain parts are going to be dramatically affected. So this high level of uncertainty, what it means, you're not going to open the border or close the border. By the way, nobody talks about this anymore. The first is when people are coming, how you're integrating them, and just getting them on the labor market is not enough. Democracies has a major difference because you don't know how to treat these people. Are they guest workers? Are they future citizens? If you look at the statistics, you're going to see that the countries with the highest percent of foreigners are non-democratic countries. It's the Gulf countries. But they're tolerating so many foreigners because basically they're treating them as non-citizens, and there is no idea that they're going to be. It's totally different in democratic politics. So how are you integrating? And here comes the problem of identity. I'm always giving this example because I was taken some years ago by a friend to one restaurant here in the 19th district. It was created as an Italian restaurant. And even now, the menu is Italian. The music is Italian. Everything is Italian. The problem is that neither the owners is the Italian, nor the cook is the Italian, nor any of the waiters have ever been in Italy. Is this an Italian restaurant? For me as a Bulgarian, it is an Italian restaurant. For Italians, probably not. Because if you're Italian and you go to an Italian restaurant, you believe that you can speak to somebody your own language. So this is a major identity changes. And this is why I say you need a time. What we know from the history of the US, every major migration wave was followed by political backlash. But then you digest, you try to reconsolidate, you basically reconcile the identities. When people basically today are telling me how many are the whites, how many are the blacks and so on in the United States, remember, at the end of the 19th century, Jews were not white. East Europeans were not whites. Irish were not whites. Sorry, Hugo, but it's the truth. And then basically it starts changing. So we are going to see new identity and not definition of what is in and then. If you see the number of the people coming from mixed marriages, the problem is, and for me this is part of the also answer to the question about the Middle East. Listen, societies are becoming so diverse that when you meet somebody, you don't expect that implicitly the other person is going to understand what you're telling. I have this huge problem with the jokes. Listen, I'm East European of a certain generation. We like jokes, but more and more you're not sure how your jokes are going to fly because it's very different. And on one level, this is me. Get the jokes out of me, I don't exist anymore. But on the other side, it's really a different world and people hear different things. And as a result of it, we are trying to come to the world in which everything should be very explicit, Everything should be kind of set, even these emojis, you should know exactly what it means. But this is a world in which you feel homeless, because home is a place which you understand and you believe that you understood there. And I do believe, and this is part of the political crisis, many people don't have the feeling that they don't understand anymore their countries, and also they don't have the feeling that they understood. And the moment some political leaders come and said, let's go back, to go back where? And from this point of view, it is going to be a different world. The role of Africa is going to go up incredibly. For Europe, this is going to be the real issue and the big issue. But of course, it's going to be felt at one moment in France and in a total different moment in Estonia or Poland.
Thank you very much. This really brings us back to the time pressure issue as well. It's just moving all so fast. How do you keep up then with understanding what is happening around you? We are reaching the end of our conversation, but before we close up, you have devoted yourself, Ivan, to the study of how things fall apart. But to prove that you're not, in fact, always a pessimist, can you tell us one thing that you feel really optimistic about?
This is very interesting, by the way. People are really obsessed with this optimism-pessimism story, not you, in general. But there is one thing which is common between optimists and pessimists. Both of them believe that they know what is going to happen. To be honest, I don't have such a certainty. From time to time, what I'm really very much annoyed about is this complacency talk, as if we know everything is under control, it's okay, we adopted this and that. And this is why what you're calling pessimism is kind of a much more provoking and saying, really? Really you believe the situation is under control? But on the other side, listen, many of the things and changes that we see are for good. Many of the things that you see is, in a certain way, in many places of the world, people live better than ever before. Yes, there is a major risk, including the risks of war, but with which period exactly you compare? And even when you talk about political instability in Europe, I see that probably all of you are young enough, but probably there are some people that have been in European politics in the 1970s, with a major terrorist attacks within the major West European countries, with kind of a social and economic conditions being totally different. So we took 20 or 30 years of exceptional stability and growth and make them the model of what is normal. This was never have been the norm. The norm was a uncertain world that was dramatically changing, that basically have been very volatile for many parts of the world. So if I'm going to talk to my grandparents and tell them that we are very pessimistic, they're going to tell me, pessimistic about what?
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you very much for joining us today.